Good evening and welcome to the Livonia Public Schools regular board meeting for July 15th, 2024. Would you take the roll, please, Mrs. Acosta?
Yes. Mrs. Bonnefield?
Here.
Mrs. Burton?
Here.
Mrs. Frank?
Here.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Here.
Mr. Johnson?
Here.
Mrs. Acosta is here. President Bradford?
Here. We have a quorum. Mrs. Jarvis, would you please lead us in the pledge?
I'd be happy to. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, good evening again. If you're tuning in from home, or is this being taped?
We're being taped.
All right. Welcome. This evening we are not at our usual spot. We are in a wonderful area tonight. We're at the Livonia, brand new Livonia Early Childhood Center this evening. So that's where we are broadcasting our meeting from. If you are looking for a joining us from home, you can go on the website at www.livoniapublicschools.org and click on the school board tab and go down to meeting information, and there you'll find our agenda for this evening. Tonight's a regular meeting or a voting meeting? So it's a voting meeting tonight. There won't be a lot of discussion on some of our items because we've seen and discussed them several times, mainly at our study session and committee of the whole meetings. So if you want to hear more information, you'll have to go back to our last meeting, which was in June, and you'll see some of those items in discussion about those topics. We're going to go ahead this evening and we are going to move item 4, communications, up to item 3, and we'll go from there. We have a lovely audience this evening of our Livonia figure skating team is here, the LPS figure skating team. So let's go ahead and go on to item 3, which is communications. A is written communications. Do I have any written communications this evening? Seeing none, I'll go on to item B, response to prior audience communications. Do we have any of that this evening? All right, perfect. We'll go on to item 3C, our audience communications. And we have one blue slip this evening, and that would be the Livonia Figure Skating Club. And I think we have 2 young ladies coming up to speak tonight. So maybe we'll have you, do you want to just sit there and speak, or would you like to stand?
You want to just pull your chair forward?
Yeah, pull your chairs forward. Yeah, pull your chairs up to the table. How about that? Thanks for being here tonight. So
that the camera will catch you.
yeah, the camera should be able to catch you this evening. Welcome. We have Bianca and is it Jillia? Welcome this evening.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Bianca Sabello. I'm a senior at Stevenson High School and a new captain.
Hello, my name is Julia Pepito. I am a senior at Churchill High School and also a new captain. Our third captain is Lily McKinley, a senior at Franklin High School, but unfortunately she's not here because she's attending leadership camp for her school's student congress.
On behalf of the entire team, we'd like to say thank you to the board for acknowledging our hard work and dedication to figure skating. We know how much time and thought you have put into making this change happen for us, and it is greatly appreciated by us all. We are so excited to start our new season being a varsity sport.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We appreciate you being here this evening, and it's great that you came all the way over to the brand new facility. So,
Mrs. Bradford?
yes.
Would you invite each of the members just to introduce themselves?
Sure, of course. Yes. Why don't you go around and you can introduce yourselves.
Oh, hi, I'm Julia Sokolowski. I'm a sophomore at Stevenson. Well, I'll be a junior.
I'm Bianca Sabello. I'm a senior at Stevenson High School and I'm one of the captains this year.
I'm Julia Pepito, also captain, and going to be a senior at Churchill.
I'm Elise Barton, and I'm going to 10th grade.
I'm Kayla Wilcox. I'm going to be a sophomore at Stevenson.
I'm Tegan Houston, and I'm going to be a freshman at Franklin High School.
I'm Molly McLendon. I'm going to be a senior at Stevenson.
I'm Kendi Sogolowski. I'm going to be a freshman at Stevenson. I'm Aubrey Steyer. I'm going to be a freshman at Stevenson.
I'm Audrey Winkleman, and I'm going to be a junior at Churchill.
I'm Mackenzie Miller and I'm going to be a junior at Stevenson High School.
I'm Kate Vanek. I'm one of the coaches.
I'm Maureen McLendon, one of the teacher sponsors.
I'm Lauren McLendon, one of the coaches. Oh, I'm Lindsay Bakken. I think maybe a sponsor this year as well. Yes.
Well, thank you so much for being here.
Parents too?
Oh, yeah.
Parents, you want to Parents. We're
Yep, we wish you all the best, and we so appreciate you coming to give your thoughts on everything that's been going on. So we appreciate you being here. And I'm going to let you know you do not have to stay for the rest of the meeting if you choose to. No, Mr. Francis, you have to stay.
Okay.
That only goes for the team and the parents, so the visitors. So thank you for visiting us this evening.
Thank
you.
Oh, wait, we have one of our board members would like to make a comment. Ms.
I
Burton?
would, and
Sure.
I don't usually do this, and forgive me for if I'm speaking out of turn, but thank you for coming back to say thank you. We have a lot of requests, and the vast majority of them are very legitimate. You're right, this one took a lot of work, but it's so very important to say thank you, and it's so rarely done here, that I wanna say thank you for all of you taking your time to actually come back once it was handled in the manner that you were appreciative of, and saying thank you. It's a really, really important life skill, and it's not done very often. So thank you for taking your time to do that.
Yeah, thank you so
Very
much.
proud
We
of all
appreciate
of
you
you.
being here.
Very-
Thank you. Anybody else? Okay.
Is it possible that we take a couple photos?
Oh, sure.
Okay, all right.
Or whatever you think.
How about, do you guys want to come around this back end? How about that?
Maybe just
Sure.
Come on. All right, let's take a 5-minute break. Is that okay? All right.
Emily's good with that.
We're working. Emily's good with that. 5-minute break. We'll be back. welcome back. We're gonna go ahead with our meeting, but we are gonna adjust it a little bit. We're gonna go on to item 9, personnel matters, and item 9A is teachers for approval. So may I have a motion, please?
President Bradford.
Mrs. Frank, thank you.
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District accept the recommendation of the superintendent and offer employment for the 2024-2025 school year to the teachers listed on the attached document.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Frank, supported by Mrs. Jarvis for teachers for approval. And this evening, we're gonna hear from Mr. Abate.
Yes, hello everybody.
Hello.
So this is a large portion of our hiring for vacancies of the upcoming school year. Mrs. Keats, myself, Mrs. Brown and her team, lots of folks and the academic services folks have been working hard to identify great candidates to fill our positions for the upcoming year, which came open for a whole variety of reasons, retirements and folks moving around, all that good stuff. So in addition to Mr. Hollinger here, who we've all just met, it will be a brand new automotive teacher over at LCTC. We have folks who are filling positions virtually across the entire district. We have elementary instruction, special ed, secondary instruction of all different types, and actually even a couple of jobs at LCTC in a couple of different areas. So they are all very well qualified. We're very proud to bring these people to you tonight. They are going to represent LPS in a manner that is consistent with our shared vision and collective commitments. The positions have been included in the 24-25 budget, and we are pleased to be recommending them to you tonight to join our LPS family. With your approval, we are very excited to have them join us and work with our kids.
Wonderful, thank you. Are there any questions or comments?
Welcome aboard.
Yes. Welcome aboard, and welcome Mr. Hollinger
Thank you all very
to
much.
Livonia Public. And we were gonna take the vote now. So we have a motion by Mrs. Frank, supported by Mrs. Jarvis for teachers for approval. Mrs. Acosta, would you take the roll, please?
Gladly. Mrs. Frank.
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis.
Yes.
Mrs. Burton.
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield.
Yes.
Mr. Johnson.
Yes.
Mrs. Acosta says yes. President Bradford.
Yes, that motion carries. Congratulations. All right, we're gonna go back up to, we're gonna move back up to item 3, no, item 4, I'm sorry. Item 4, annual organization. Oh no, here we go. Organizational matters. All right, and we have item A, the adoption of the 2024-2025 bylaws to establish meeting dates and other procedures. May I have a motion, please? Yeah, we gotta get back to her.
Yes.
Yeah, she's got it. Sorry, ma'am.
Okay. President Bradford.
Mrs. Acosta.
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District adopt the attached bylaws to establish 2024-2025 board meeting dates, procedures for the calling and posting of board meetings, and authorization to sign contracts and legal documents for the board.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Acosta, supported by Mrs. Burton, for the adoption of 2024-25 bylaws to establish meeting dates and other procedures. This evening, we'll hear from Mrs. Oquist.
Thank you so much, President Bradford.
You're
So
welcome.
on the attachment that goes along with this item, you will see our list of regular meeting dates for the school year. As you know, based on the open meetings law, we are required to adopt annually the meeting schedule for this school year. We have reviewed it with the board in study session and in the committee meeting. We have also had these dates posted. These meetings will all begin at 6:30 p.m. and they are posted on our district website.
Wonderful, thank you. Any questions or comments from the board? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Acosta, supported by Mrs. Burton, for the adoption of the 2024-2025 bylaws to establish meeting dates and other procedures. Mrs. Acosta, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Acosta says yes. Mrs. Burton.
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield.
Yes.
Mrs. Frank.
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis.
Yes.
Mr. Johnson.
Yes.
President Bradford.
Yes, that motion carries. Moving on to item 3B, the designation of 2024-2025 bank depositories. May I have a motion, please?
President Bradford.
Mrs. Bonnefield.
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District designate J.P. Morgan Chase Bank and Michigan Liquid Asset Fund Plus as depositories for the school district during the 24-25 school year.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Bonnefield, supported by Mr. Johnson, for the designation of the 2024-2025 bank depositories. This evening we'll hear from Mrs. Smith.
Thank you. These are two institutions that we've had long-standing relationships with, and this is not a change from this current year. We use Chase for our day-to-day banking, and I'm very satisfied with that relationship. And then we use MyLaugh for any excess cash that we have. We invest with MyLaugh to get some extra investment earnings. So we're proposing to do the same for this coming school year.
Great, thank you. Any questions or comments from the board? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Bonnefield, supported by Mr. Johnson, for the designation of the 2024-2025 bank depositories. Mrs. Acosta, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Bonnefield?
Yes.
Mr. Johnson?
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mrs. Acosta says yes. President Bradford?
Yes, that motion carries. Moving on to item 4C, the appointment of an investment officer. May I have a motion, please?
President Bradford,
Mrs. Burton.
move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District appoint the treasurer, Ms. Allison Smith, as the investment officer in conjunction with the district's investment policy for the 2024-2025 school year.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Burton, supported by Mrs. Jarvis, for the appointment of an investment officer, and we're gonna hear from Mrs. Oquist. Right?
Yes.
Okay.
So definitive.
Yes. So as the investment officer, Ms. Smith will oversee the day-to-day management of the district investments. Of course, we work closely together on all items related to finance, but she will be directly responsible for transferring funds to our investment transactions and for the investment of our operating funds, which, as you know, has been done extremely successfully. Mrs. Smith has taken opportunities to utilize our assets and invest them in a way that it has brought forth great return for our general fund and for our bond proceeds. And so we always do that consistent with the policy and the actions of the board.
Thank you, Superintendent Oquist. Any other questions or comments from the board? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Burton, supported by Mrs. Jarvis, for the appointment of an investment officer. Mrs. Acosta, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mr. Johnson?
Yes.
Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield?
Yes.
Mrs. Acosta says yes. President Bradford?
Yes, that motion carries. Moving on to item 4D, the appointment of staff member to be in charge of elections. May I have a motion, please?
President Bradford.
Mrs. Frank.
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District acknowledge the appointment of Philip Francis as the staff member in charge of school elections for the 2024-2025 school year. This appointment is made by the board secretary with formal acknowledgement by the Board of Education.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Frank, supported by Mrs. Bonnefield, for the appointment of staff member to be in charge of elections. And we're gonna hear from Mrs. Oquist.
Thank you, President Bradford. Yes, Mrs. Acosta has chosen Mr. Francis to be the staff member in charge of elections as the secretary of our board according to state election laws. The secretary is required to officially appoint a staff member. Mr. Francis has been hoping for this opportunity, and once again, he has been chosen for this special role. He will continue to work in close concert, of course, with our city clerk and the city of Livonia and cities of Livonia and Westland as we prepare for elections each year, and we do appreciate his efforts.
Any questions or comments from the board?
You're welcome.
Yes.
Yep, seeing none, all right. We are, have a motion by Mrs. Frank, supported by Mrs. Bonnefield, for the appointment of staff member to be in charge of elections. Mrs. Acosta, would you take the roll, please?
Yes. Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield?
Yes.
Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mr. Johnson?
Yes.
Mrs. Acosta says yes. President Bradford?
Yes, that motion carries. Moving on to item 4E, the appointment of a staff member to be responsible for posting board meeting notices. May I have a motion, please?
President Bradford,
Mr. Johnson.
move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District acknowledge the appointment of the superintendent as the administrator in charge of posting meeting notices. This appointment is made by the board secretary with formal acknowledgement by the Board of Education.
Support.
We have a motion by Mr. Johnson, supported by Mrs. Burton, for the appointment of staff member to be responsible for posting board meeting notices. And we're gonna hear from Mrs. Oquist.
Thank you, President Bradford. Once again, Mrs. Acosta, as the secretary of the board, is responsible for causing notice to be given to the public of all board meetings. As you know, she signs our meeting notices, which are posted for each and every meeting. We take that responsibility in the superintendent's office, and I work with Mrs. Junta, who is the administrative assistant to the superintendent in the board, and she takes care of the actual posting of meeting notices.
Thank you, Mrs. Oquist. Any
You're welcome.
questions or comments from the board? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mr. Johnson, supported by Mrs. Burton, for the appointment of staff member to be responsible for posting board meeting notices. Mrs. Acosta, would you take the roll, please?
Mr. Johnson,
Yes.
Mrs. Burton,
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield,
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis,
Yes.
Mrs. Frank,
Yes.
Mrs. Acosta says yes. President Bradford.
Yes, and we have,
Motion passed.
motion's passed. The motion passed. All right, moving on to item 5, consent agenda. May I have a motion, please?
President Bradford,
Mrs. Jarvis.
move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District approve the following consent agenda items as recommended by the superintendent. 6A, minutes of the public hearing of June 17th, 2024. 6B, minutes of the regular meeting of June 17th, 2024.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Jarvis, supported by Mr. Johnson, for the consent agenda. Is there any member of the board that wishes to remove any items at this time? Okay, and is there any discussion? All right, then we will go ahead. We have a motion by Mrs. Jarvis, supported by Mr. Johnson, for the consent agenda. Mrs. Acosta, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Jarvis.
Yes.
Mr. Johnson,
Yes.
Mrs. Frank,
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield,
Yes.
Mrs. Burton,
Yes.
Mrs. Acosta says yes. President Bradford.
Yes, that motion carries. Moving on to, going down to item 7, business matters. We have item 7A, approval of pizza bid for school meal program, 2024, all the way to 2027. And may I have a motion, please?
President Bradford.
Mrs. Acosta.
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District approve the submitted bid by Domino's Pizza for delivery of pizza in the amount of $8 per pizza for the district's school lunch program through the 2024-2027 school years.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Acosta, supported by Mrs. Jarvis, for the approval of pizza bid for school meal program 2024 to 2027. And Mr. Francis, welcome.
Thank you. This is something that we have to do every few years because we go out to bid for the school lunch programs pizza, which has to fall as far as all the ingredients and the making of the pizza under the federal guidelines of the food program. So we did go out for the public bid. We had 2 responders. Domino's was the low responsible bidder, and much to our delight, we found that they did not increase their price from the past 3 years, and we had them under contract as well. They've done a very nice job. Ms. Schuhart is the supervisor of food services, and she supports continuing with Domino's. I support as well, and they have the appropriate and correct ingredients in their pizza. They've been delivering and helping the past few years, and they have not increased their price from the last contract. So we do support them. And a quick note just to clarify the dates. We do have 2024 to 2027. Those are for school dates, so that would be for the 24-25 school year, 25-26 school year, 26-27 school year. So not calendar, but school years.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any questions or comments? All right, sounds like the kids are gonna enjoy some more pizza. Perfect. All right, we have a motion by Mrs. Acosta, supported by Mrs. Jarvis for the approval of pizza bid for school meal program, school years 2024 to 2027. Mrs. Acosta, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Acosta says yes. Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Mr. Johnson?
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield?
Yes.
Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
President Bradford?
Yes, that motion carries. Moving on to item 7B, the establishment of tuition rate for 2024-2025. May I have a motion, please?
President Bradford,
Mrs. Bonnefield.
move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District establish the tuition rate for the 24-25 school year as $14,673 for non-resident students per board policy JBCB non-resident students.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Bonnefield, supported by Mr. Johnson, for the establishment of tuition rate for the 2024-2025 school year, and we're gonna hear from Mrs. Smith again.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
We have board policy JBCB that speaks to non-resident students, and as you know, as a general rule, we do not accept non-resident students unless through our Schools of Choice program. And on rare case, perhaps in the case of a senior maybe moving out of the district that wants to finish their career with Livonia Public Schools, we can make an exception to that rule. And our board policy and state law requires that we establish a tuition rate for students that continue to attend the district when they are outside of our boundaries. So we take the operating expenditures from the previous year and divide that by the number of students in attendance to establish the tuition rate. And so with your approval tonight, we will pass that on to our pupil accounting office, and on the rare case that we need it, we'll have that rate established.
Thank you. Any questions or comments? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Bonnefield, supported by Mr. Johnson, for the establishment of tuition rate for the 2024-2025 school year. Mrs. Acosta, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Bonnefield?
Yes.
Mr. Johnson?
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Mrs. Acosta says yes. President Bradford?
Yes, and that motion carries. Thank you, Mrs. Smith. All right, moving along here. Item 8, instructional matters, and we're going on to item 8A, the updated U.S. history and world history purchases. May I have a motion, please?
President Bradford,
Mrs. Burton.
move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District approve the purchase of additional classroom sets of History Alive, Pursuing American Ideals, and History Alive, World Connections by TCI Publishing, located in Mountain View, California, digital and physical textbooks for the global education courses for the total amount of $15,487. This purchase would include one classroom set of each textbook and 6-year student licenses. The physical teacher guides, resources, and 6 years of teacher digital licenses will be provided at no additional cost to the district.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Burton, supported by Mrs. Bonnefield, for the updated U.S. history and world history purchases, and we're gonna hear from Mrs. O'Brien.
Thank you, President Bradford.
You're welcome.
I wanted to bring this purchase to you, even though it does not meet the threshold for your vote, because we just approved these 2 textbooks, American History in May, and then the World History in June. And what we found right after we approved at the last board meeting was that the global education department's student numbers were not in our total count. So we needed to buy a complete set of physical textbooks of both of these books for our global ed students, and then additional student licenses so they have access. And in the past, sometimes global ed uses their own materials because they are a magnet program, but they were a part of this textbook adoption, but their numbers did not get turned in to us when we got our quotes. So I wanted to bring it to you to make sure, since it is connected to what we just purchased, that you are aware and then have the opportunity to vote for these additional copies.
Thank you, Mrs. O'Brien, we appreciate that very much. Is there any questions or comments, Mrs. Burton?
Yes, since this is, the same textbook, but used in global education, do you, you may not know the answer to this, and if not, you can get back to this later, but do you know how it's gonna be handled differently than it would be in the global ed program, than it would be handled in the regular history classes?
So we've been working more closely, so global education as a magnet program kind of had their own curriculum map of what they did. We've been working much closer with them through Mrs. Russo, our ELA social studies coordinator, to help create and map out what the year's program would look like. So they were a part of this discussion and choosing of this book. So now we're going to take that curriculum and say, so what does it look like when we're using it within that magnet program? So it won't be used in the exact same way. It would be in a U.S. history class or a world history class, but it would fall under how they're going to take the same resource but build it under their global education curriculum map. So they're working on writing that curriculum map this year, utilizing these new resources.
Okay. And is that, in part to make certain that that global education program is aligned with the state standards?
Yes.
Okay. All right, thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions? Okay, seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Frank, supported by, motion by Mrs. Burton, supported by Mrs. Bonnefield, for the updated U.S. history and world history purchases. Mrs. Acosta, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Burton,
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield,
Yes.
Mr. Johnson,
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis,
Yes.
Mrs. Frank,
Yes.
Mrs. Acosta says yes. President Bradford.
Yes, and that motion carries.
Thank you.
Thank you. Moving on to item 9, personnel matters. We already did item 9A previously, so we will go on to item 9B, leaves of absence. May I have a motion, please?
President Bradford,
Mr. Johnson?
move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District accept the recommendation of the superintendent and approve the request for a leave of absence as listed below. And I apologize if I don't pronounce the name right. Megan Norcia, August 21st, 2024. Alexandria Surgison, November 15th, 2024.
Support.
We have a motion by Mr. Johnson, supported by Mrs. Frank, for leaves of absence, and we're going to hear from Mr. Abadi again. Thank you.
Yes, hello. Yes, quite simply, both leaves have been requested in accordance with collective bargaining agreements, so we just ask that you approve the leaves as presented.
Thank you. Any questions or comments? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mr. Johnson, supported by Mrs. Frank, for leaves of absence. Mrs. Acosta, would you take the roll, please?
Mr. Johnson,
Yes.
Mrs. Frank,
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield,
Yes.
Mrs. Burton,
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis,
Yes.
Mrs. Acosta says yes. President Bradford.
Yes, and that motion carries. Moving on to item 9C, retirements. May I have a motion, please?
President Bradford,
Mrs. Jarvis?
move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District adopt the attached resolution of appreciation for services rendered by Kevin Hafner.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Jarvis, supported by Mr. Johnson, for retirements, and we're gonna hear from, surprise, Mr. Abate.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, we just have the one name that we celebrate this evening, Mr. Kevin Hafner of Franklin High School. He spent 24 years instructing the students at Franklin High School. We appreciate his contributions both to the Franklin community and specifically to the students that he supported over all of those years. We thank him, and we would ask that you approve his resolution of appreciation.
Thank you very much. Any questions or comments? Happy retirement. Happy retirement, that's awesome. All right, we have a motion by Mrs. Jarvis, supported by Mr. Johnson, for retirements. Mrs. Acosta, would you take the roll?
Mrs. Jarvis,
Yes.
Mr. Johnson,
Yes.
Mrs. Frank,
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield,
Yes.
Mrs. Burton,
Yes.
Mrs. Acosta says yes. President Bradford.
Yes, that motion carries. All right, we're moving on to Item 10, hearing from board members, and we have item 10A, the second reading and adoption of board policy, bylaws of the board, board operations, BBBC, board member expenses and development opportunities. May I have a motion, please?
President Bradford,
Mrs. Acosta.
move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District accept the recommendation of the Policy Committee and adopt board policy language for the attached document for bylaws of the board, board operations, BBBC, board member expenses, and development opportunities.
Support. We have a motion by Mrs. Acosta, supported by Mrs. Frank, for the second reading and adoption of board policy, bylaws of the board, board operations, BBBC, board member expenses and development opportunities. Mrs. O'Quist.
Thank you, President Bradford. As you know, we reviewed this policy at our study session, our committee of the whole meeting, and we had our first reading at our last board meeting on June 17th. There have been no changes made since that time, and we recommend your approval this evening.
Thank you. Does anybody have any questions or comments? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Acosta, supported by Mrs. Frank, for the second reading and adoption of board policy, bylaws of the board, board operations, BBBC, board member expenses and development opportunities. Mrs. Acosta, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Acosta says yes. Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mr. Johnson?
Yes.
Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield?
Yes.
President Bradford.
Yes, that motion carries. Moving on to item 10B, the second reading and adoption of board policy instructional program, IHAA, Common Summative Assessments. May I have a motion, please?
President Bradford,
Mrs. Bonnefield.
move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District accept the recommendation of the Policy Committee and adopt board policy language per the attached document for board policy IHAA, Common Summative Assessments.
Support. We have a motion by Mrs. Bonnefield, supported by Mrs. Frank, for the second reading and adoption of board policy instructional program, IHAA, Common Summative Assessments. Mrs. O'Brien.
Thank you, President Bradford.
You're welcome.
I am happy to bring this policy for its second reading. We went over it at study session and committee of the whole, and its first reading was held on June 17th. We updated this policy from final examinations to what we currently are doing, which is our common summative assessments. It stands the way it was read during our first reading on June 17th.
Thank you very much. Any questions or comments? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Bonnefield, supported by Mrs. Frank, for the second reading and adoption of board policy instructional program, IHAA, Common Summative Assessments. Mrs. Acosta, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Bonnefield?
Yes.
Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mr. Johnson?
Yes.
Mrs. Acosta says yes. President Bradford.
Yes, and that motion carries. Moving on to item 10C, second reading and adoption of board policy instructional program, IHAB, reporting to parents and guardians. May I have a motion, please?
President Bradford,
Mrs. Burton.
move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District accept the recommendation of the Policy Committee and adopt board policy language per the attached document for board policy IHAB, reporting to parents and guardians.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Burton, supported by Mrs. Bonnefield, for the second reading and adoption of board policy instructional program, IHAB, reporting to parents and guardians. Mrs. O'Brien.
Thank you again. We brought this policy to the last study session committee of the whole and had our first reading on June 17th. This policy is from 2015 and we updated it to represent how we report to our parents, how students are doing in our schools. So not just report cards, but how we provide them oral and written reporting on how their students are doing academically. So this was updated through our policy committee, and we ask that it be adopted.
Thank you. Any questions or comments from the board? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Burton, supported by Mrs. Bonnefield, for the second reading and adoption of board policy instructional program, IHAB, reporting to parents and guardians. Mrs. Acosta, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Burton,
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield,
Yes.
Mrs. Frank,
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis,
Yes.
Mr. Johnson.
Yes.
Mrs. Acosta says yes. President Bradford.
Yes, that motion carries. Moving on to item 10D, second reading and adoption of board policy instructional program, IHF, graduation requirements. May I have a motion, please?
President Bradford.
Mrs. Frank.
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District accept the recommendation of the Policy Committee and adopt board policy language per the attached document for Board Policy IHF, graduation requirements.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Frank, supported by Mrs. Bonnefield, for the second reading and adoption of board policy instructional program, IHF, graduation requirements. Mrs. O'Brien.
Thank you, President Bradford. This policy we also talked about and had its first reading on June 17th. We updated the graduation requirements for our personal finance, which is under our social studies department. And for this policy, we updated the policy itself and put the number of units and courses into the administrative procedures so that when there are changes at the state level, they would be more easily represented through the administrative procedures, which is how we make board policies come to life within our schools. So we ask that, no, there's been no changes since June 17th, and we ask that this be adopted as it is.
Thank you, Mrs. O'Brien. Any questions or comments? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Frank, supported by Mrs. Bonnefield, for the second reading and adoption of board policy instructional program, IHF, graduation requirements. Mrs. Acosta, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Frank,
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield,
Yes.
Mrs. Burton,
Yes.
Mr. Johnson,
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis.
Yes.
Mrs. Acosta says yes. President Bradford.
Yes, and that motion carries. Thank you, Mrs. O'Brien.
Thank you.
Moving on to item 10E, the second reading and adoption of board policy, business management, EG, insurance management. May I have a motion, please?
President Bradford.
Mr. Johnson.
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District accept the recommendation of the Policy Committee and adopt board policy language per the attached document for Board Policy EG, Insurance Management.
Support.
We have a motion by Mr. Johnson, supported by Mrs. Jarvis, for the second reading and adoption of board policy, business management, EG, insurance management. And we're gonna hear from Mrs. Smith.
Thank you. Similar to our last few policies, this too was discussed at a recent study session. We did our first reading at the June 17th meeting, and it's not changed since the June 17th meeting. The changes we made are nothing to change the intent of the policy, but just some updated wording to hopefully make it more understandable.
Great, thank you. Any questions or comments? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mr. Johnson, supported by Mrs. Jarvis, for the second reading and adoption of board policy, business management, EG, insurance management. Mrs. Acosta, would you take the roll, please?
Mr. Johnson,
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis,
Yes.
Mrs. Frank,
Yes.
Mrs. Burton,
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield.
Yes.
Mrs. Acosta says yes. President Bradford.
Yes, that motion carries. All right, moving on to item 10F, the second reading and adoption of board policy, business management, EGAE, annuities. May I have a motion, please?
President Bradford.
Mrs. Jarvis.
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District accept the recommendation of the Policy Committee and adopt board policy language per the attached document for Board Policy EGAE, annuities.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Jarvis, supported by Mr. Johnson, for the second reading and adoption of board policy, business management, EGAE annuities. And we're gonna hear from Mrs. Smith.
Thank you. Again, similar to the past policies, we've discussed this at the study session, committee meeting, and then did a first reading at the June 17th meeting, where we have not made any changes since then. The main change to this was adding some additional verbiage to explain the retirement savings options available to our employees, and then also reflecting, taking off one of the employee groups that was listed on there that's no longer an associated employee group.
Great, thank you. Any questions or comments? Mrs. Burton?
This is just a grammatical thing, and I'm not sure how we didn't notice it last time, or if we did and somehow it got changed. The way it's reading right now, public school employee R, and R is underlined, and I don't know why. So it reads, public school employee are automatically enrolled. Two quick questions. We need an S on the end of employee to make it employees, and I don't know why, I think it's probably needing to not be underlined. The word are is underlined. I think it was probably from discussion in the previous meeting saying we need an S on the end because are is plural, but it looks like that has not been done.
I think there was an S in there, so I'm not sure what happened with that, but we definitely would like there to be an S, and the R should not be underlined.
So could we reflect that in the final, as the final, could we,
That's okay with
could
me.
we reread that first sentence?
You're right,
absolutely. Sure.
To reflect, since we'll have that read into the
Mrs.
record.
Burton, why don't you read that?
So it will read, public school employees are automatically enrolled in the Michigan Public School Employees Retirement System, MIPSers, and the remaining portion of the policy will be as it is written.
And then would you follow up, please, with Mrs. Junta to make sure that that's reflected? Thank you.
All right, and everybody is good with that? So, all right, any questions or comments additional? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Jarvis, supported by Mr. Johnson, for the second reading and adoption of board policy, business management, EGAE annuities. Mrs. Acosta, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mr. Johnson?
Yes.
Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield?
Yes.
Mrs. Acosta says yes. President Bradford?
Yes, and that motion carries. Moving on to item 10G, the second reading and adoption of board policy, insurance program, EGB, student insurance. May I have a motion, please?
President Bradford?
Mrs. Acosta?
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District accept the recommendation of the Policy Committee and adopt board policy language per the attached document for board policy EGB, student insurance.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Acosta, supported by Mr. Johnson, for the second reading and adoption of board policy, insurance program, EGB, student insurance. Mrs. Smith?
Thank you. As discussed, we discussed this at our study session, committee meeting, and then did a first reading on June 17th. We haven't made any changes. You'll recall from our study session that we mentioned that this was something that's proposed by Trim Law Firm, and so we are proposing to adopt language that was prepared by attorneys. And again, this isn't a change in our practice or policy, the intent, but just updating the wording.
Thank you. Any questions or comments? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Acosta, supported by Mr. Johnson, for the second reading and adoption of board policy, insurance program, EGB, student insurance. Mrs. Acosta, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Acosta says yes. Mr. Johnson?
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield?
Yes.
Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
President Bradford?
Yes, that motion carries. All right, thank you, Mrs. Smith. We will move on to item 10H, hearing from board members. Is there anybody that would like to have any information or like to speak this evening? Mrs. Frank?
Thank you so much. I just wanted to thank Mrs. Oquist and your entire team for tonight, for the opening, the beautiful opening, grand opening, our open house of the Early Childhood Center. It was a beautiful day. You all worked very, very hard, and your team worked very hard yesterday to get ready for the day, and all of everybody who was involved. It was a beautiful day, and thank you to all of our community who came out to support and to see the building. It was wonderful to see so many community members involved and really wanting to see what this is all about. So we're so thankful to the taxpayers and just for everybody who was involved in this, in opening this event, or this building.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Mrs. Jarvis?
Well, Mrs. Frank stole most of my thunder, but what I'd like to add on there is a thank you to our community members who attended. There were so many people. We're estimating probably 1,000 families came through. And we tried to answer questions and talk to everybody. But if you have any questions that we weren't able to answer, please don't hesitate to call the central office and get an answer to your question. We're so excited to see so many people that were really thrilled to be here tonight, and we want you to all be excited about this building. So any questions or something, we'd be happy to answer.
Thank you. Anybody else? It really truly was a wonderful day, and it was exciting to see so many of our former Jackson Center employees came by. Some of our senior residents came in, and neighboring community members came through, and then a whole slew of families and their children. And the joy and the happiness on their faces when they walked through was just really joyful to see everybody. And I think the best review was a couple of kids that came out crying, and I said to them, "Oh, why are you crying?" And the parents said, "Because they don't want to leave." So we know that that's probably one of the best reviews, but they are planning on being back in the fall. So it was just a wonderful day, and we are so grateful to the community for passing these bonds for us, because this is where it all begins with our littlest learners. So everybody here in this room is just thrilled, beyond thrilled, to have this opening coming up in few weeks here, and end of August here, early September. So we're excited about it, and we hope that you will come visit us or go online, and like Liz said, if you have any questions, give us a call. So, Mrs. Acosta.
On that note, I just wanted to add, there were so many community members that came to visit that inquired about employment, and we are always hiring, so please do not hesitate to check out our website for employment opportunities.
Wonderful. And anything else? Is there any other business that we need to speak about before the board tonight? Seeing none, we're adjourned. Have a good evening.
Thank you.